Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hello there, and welcome to episode 70 of TheKillFile. I'm so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First off, please take a second to rate, review, subscribe, or follow wherever you listen. It's the best way to support the podcast, and it only takes a second. Thank you so much. Secondly, the bonus content will be rolling out very soon over on Patreon, where you can pay a few bucks a month for a couple of bonus episodes. And as the podcast grows, so will the perks. These episodes will be a little different than our regular ones here on Monday. These will be things circling true crime like natural disasters, assassinations, and other categories. One of the things that I would like to get up and running will be something called Listener Files, where you guys can write in your own true crime stories or someone you know, and I will compile them into episodes and I'll read them back to you with my commentary. So I'm looking for anything from a light and funnier true crime story to anything dark and not so funny. It can be a time that you got caught stealing something stupid when you were a kid and maybe your parents had a funny punishment, or maybe your mom and dad were a drug lord or kingpin and you want to share your experiences. You can always stay anonymous and feel free to change any names, but please write in whatever you can to thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com, or you can fill out the form over on our website, thekillfile.com, where you can also submit a case that you want me to cover. And you can find the awesome KillFile merch. Just click the link Shop Merch. If you haven't had a chance to check out our cozy line for the fall and winter, please do. We add new stuff all the time, and you're sure to find something that you love, and you can sport your favorite true crime merch with the rest of us. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about a serial killer named Gary Ray Bowles. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, homophobia, and brutality. Let's jump in. Today's story is going to start us off in Savannah, Georgia, in the year of 1994, where local headlines from the Savannah Tribune would read, quote, "Universal health coverage needed for Georgia's black children," end quote. Another would read, quote, "Jackie Robinson voted favorite baseball player of all time." In May of 1994, a gruesome scene would unfold on Savannah's Country Club golf course off of President Street when a man who was said to be 72 years old would be found dead. Milton Bradley, a World War II veteran, would be found beaten to death behind a shed on the course. Authorities would eventually put together the pieces of the murder and several murders that would be all linked to a man named Gary Ray Bowles, aka the I-95 killer. Although he had an alias as well, and we will get to that. Let's first learn a little bit about Bowles and where he came from. Let's find out if there's anything in his past that might point to the fact that Bowles may not have ended up being the most upstanding citizen when he grew up. Gary Ray Bowles was born on July 25th, 1962. Gary's father was said to be a coal miner who would unfortunately die from something called black lung disease, which I've heard of, but I wasn't exactly sure what it was, so I did a little research. Black lung disease, according to the Cleveland Clinic, is inflammation and scarring of the lungs, which can be common in people who work for the mines. They start coughing up black mucus and their chests get tight. There's no cure for it, although medicines can help ease some of the symptoms. Some sources would say that Gary's father would die before Gary was born, but either way, his mother Frances would end up in a few marriages afterwards. After she had been married the first time, Gary's new stepfather was abusive towards Gary and his brother. Apparently, when Frances tried to step in to protect her sons, the stepfather would then become abusive towards her. He was known to have beat the boys with his fists or a belt, but thankfully, she would end up divorced from this man. Now, Gary's second stepfather wouldn't end up much different than his first. Chet, Gary's second stepfather, would go into violent rages when he would drink, and this is when he too would beat Gary, his brother, and Frances. I wonder what Frances's childhood was like, if maybe she went through some abuse or trauma herself, and maybe unknowingly sought out somebody that was kind of abusive. Of course, that's just my conjecture, I have no idea, but it makes me wonder. Sources said that Chet was so brutal that Frances ended up in the hospital on multiple occasions, which could not have been easy growing up in a home like that and watching your whole world at that age, your mother end up so hurt and so often? Around the age of 10, Gary was said to have started experimenting with drugs, and he also sniffed and huffed paint and glue as well. So we've all heard that people have done this or do this, but I personally have never sniffed or huffed any sort of paint or anything, and was kind of curious what the effects were and what it can do to a person, so I did a little research for us. According to the American Addiction Center, inhalants, which include various chemicals, all produce something that is close to an anesthetic, which affects your bodily systems by slowing them down, and people who inhale the chemicals for longer periods of time will notice a more powerful effect. I guess when you sniff or huff, the effects are pretty quick because the fumes are absorbed fast into your bloodstream through your lungs, and the effects are similar to being drunk. The effects also include dizziness or being lightheaded, feeling uncoordinated, euphoria, and slurring your speech. Some of the long-term effects of this, though, can include serious problems like issues with school, obviously, weakness, weight loss, mood swings, which can include being irritable and depressed. But the scariest is that it can cause heart issues, and this can include a heart attack. Now, let's talk about the long-term effects for doing something so stupid. And let me just say that it's not just kids that do this, apparently. Older people do this as well, but both sets of ages are known to huff different chemicals, which I thought was weird. Anyways, if you're dumb enough in your youth to do something like this, then the effects it can have on your brain and your system can be quite detrimental, unfortunately. A study that was conducted and then published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology would say that people who have a history of huffing or sniffing not only performed worse on neuropsychological tests, being slower, their memory is affected, as well as their attention span, but long-term abuse of the chemicals would actually show alterations in the person's brain, and it also affects their muscular strength, motor coordination, vision, hearing, loss of brain tissue, and in the part of the brain that controls different parts of the thought process and movement. And finally, the brains of people who did this long-term were also seen as having white matter abnormalities in their brains as well. So you can guess huffing or sniffing chemicals is not great for your brain or your body, and it can have some long-term serious effects, which is scary. The drugs and huffing were basically a way for Gary to escape what's going on at his home, which is understandable, but doing these things at such a young age had to have had a lifelong effect on Gary, and that's besides the abuse. He was said to have dropped out of school when he was in 8th grade, and home life was unchanging. Chet was still abusive, and at the same time, Gary and his brother were growing to hate their stepfather. When Gary was 13 or 14 years old, him and his brother had had enough of Chet's abuse, and one day, they would, together, beat the shit out of Chet. And during the beating, one of the boys hit Chet in the head with a rock. Francis would unfortunately stay married to Chet, and after this, Gary decided that he couldn't do this anymore, and he left his home. During his adolescence, Gary would make money by being a sex worker for men, but the money he made was never really enough. Not enough to provide himself any kind of living situation or stable environment, so throughout most of his younger years and into his adulthood, he was homeless. Gary would claim not to be a gay man, but rather claimed that he engaged in sex with other men purely for the money. An article written about this case by Todd Simmons would say that Gary alleged that he only allowed oral sex for his clients and not actual sexual intercourse because he was said to have been interested in women. He had a few relationships with women as he got older, and he would go and live with some of them, in fact. Unfortunately for the women, Gary would end up violent with some of them, and none of his relationships would end up lasting. In 1982, Gary would end up being arrested after he beat and sexually assaulted his girlfriend. The woman during the attack was known to have bruising around her throat, which to the authorities would suggest that he had tried to strangle her. They would also find on this poor woman that her face was severely beaten, and it was said to be so swollen that her eyes were closed. She was also said to have evidence that Gary bit one of her breasts, and then during her exam, doctors would find lacerations internally in both her rectum and vagina. The crime scene from the attack on his girlfriend was said to be quite a bloody one. In fact, it was stated in the investigation that splattering of blood was found on the walls of her bedroom and above her bed as high as 5 feet. For this, he would be sentenced to a measly 6 years, and then he would be released in 1991. I cannot believe that he only got 6 years for something so brutal. Like, hello, this guy almost killed someone that he was supposed to care for, and you think that 6 years in prison is going to change him? Come on. When Gary was released, he would be pretty quickly arrested again, but this time it was for stealing an elderly lady's purse. Yeah, he's a real charm, huh? In Volusia County, Florida, Gary was said to have shoved an older woman down to the ground and then proceeded to steal her purse and take off. Thankfully, he was caught and arrested and sentenced to 4 years for this. I'm sorry, he only gets 2 years less for, sadly, pushing down this lady and stealing her purse, but compared to the severe beating and sexual assault that his girlfriend got from him, wow. After this, Gary would go on a violent killing spree that his life had seemingly been building towards. April 14th, 1994 would turn out to be a violent day for one man in particular. When police would arrive to the home of a 59-year-old man named John Hardy Roberts, they would find a man dead, having been brutally killed, strangled to death, along with trauma to his head, and the authorities would find a rag stuffed into his mouth. Along with this, one of John's fingers was almost severed completely from his hand. The authorities would find that the room seemed to show where a struggle had taken place, complete with blood splattering. On the floor by the crime scene showed glass from a lamp and coffee table. This crime seemed to be a robbery gone wrong in that the victim's credit cards along with the cash were both gone. After the murder, the investigators would link one suspect to the crime, Gary Ray Bowles, due to his fingerprints being left at the crime scene, and when the authorities checked phone records for the victim, Gary had called multiple times to the home, and to top it off, Gary's probation paperwork was also at John's home. Sloppy. They also realized Gary had tried to use the victim's credit card after he had killed him. The authorities were immediately looking for Gary, and although they located his vehicle in Georgia, they couldn't find Gary. As they followed the leads in the case, they would find that Gary had gone up to Maryland, where yet another murder had happened in a similar fashion. During his confessions, Gary would tell the authorities that John Roberts had graciously allowed Gary to stay with him for a short term, and there was speculation that Gary may have engaged in sexual acts for money from Roberts. After Gary had been staying with John for quite a few weeks, there was said to be some type of disagreement over a woman, and this is when John would ask Gary to get out. In a rage, Gary went after John and hit him in the head over and over with the glass lamp, and when John tried to get away from Gary, he fell into the coffee table, where Gary would then strangle him, steal his wallet, and then bolted. David Jarman, a 38-year-old man from Maryland, was found deceased in the basement of his home, where a maintenance man would sadly find him. David had been, similarly to John, beaten and then strangled, and the calling card was left behind. The victim had a rag stuffed into his mouth. Again, David's car and wallet were both missing. According to an article on Advocate by Todd Simmons, David had been seen in a gay bar the night before he was killed. The bar was in Washington, D.C., and witnesses saw David with a man who would match Gary's description, and what's more is, even though it was David's credit card that had been used at the bar to presumably pay for the drinks, it was actually Gary Bowles' signature on the receipts. They again had Gary pinned for this murder as well, and they would charge him with it if and when they could find him. Weeks later, the trail of the two murder investigations would now lead authorities to Savannah, Georgia. This brings us to the murder of 72-year-old Milton Bradley, whose body had been found behind a shed on the golf course. People who knew Milton would say that he liked happy hour at a tavern called Faces. Witnesses there would say there was some mysterious man who was playing pool who gave the name Mike. One of the men who encountered this Mike man who had played pool with him that night was a man named Danny Klein. Danny would say that him and Mike were playing pool, but the game ended faster than it needed to because he could tell that he did not like this Mike guy. Danny would say that it was pretty obvious that this Mike was a hustler and was coming into this bar playing all of the older men and taking their money, and that didn't seem to sit too well with Danny. This, according to an AETV interview. When the evening was wrapping up, Milton was going to take a taxi home, but this is when Mike, the hustler, would offer him a ride home. According to an interview with Gary Bowles later on, he would claim it was the bartender who had asked him if he would be willing to take Milton home. Now, there are some things to know about Milton, the well-known resident of the area. Milton was a World War II veteran and had been an operator in the Navy. Sources would say that Milton was a nice and gentle man who was generous, almost too generous. One source would say that Milton had somehow gotten spinal meningitis, and another source would end up saying that he had received a gnarly head injury during the war, but either way, Milton would end up receiving a lobotomy. The lobotomy would end up causing Milton to have some brain injuries, and sadly, he was said to have reverted back to a childlike mental state. Danny would say that it didn't seem like Milton really knew what was going on most of the time, and this is why he kind of stuck to his own little area of the city where he lived. He didn't seem to venture very far out from his home. So most of us know the term lobotomy and maybe how it's performed, but I wanted to find out a little bit more on the subject so I could tell us all exactly what it is and how it happens. Before lobotomies came around from a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz, patients with any type of mental illness would receive drilled holes into the skull, also known as trepanning, which means to pierce a bone or skull to try and heal it, or to find a diagnosis. I will have links in the show notes if you want to know more about trepanning or lobotomies, by the way. So they drilled the holes since prehistoric times, apparently, to release the evil spirits. However, a lobotomy was thought to be the solution to a plethora of mental illnesses, and the man who invented it thought that people who were known to have obsessive behaviors were basically suffering from some sort of circuit problem in the brain. And his thought was that if you sever the connective fibers of that particular neuron activity, then it could be solved. Of course, other techniques were built off this main idea, but basically, a lobotomy was where surgeons would, according to BBC News, quote, drill a pair of holes into the skull, either at the side or top, and push in a sharp instrument, a leucotome, into the brain. The surgeon would sweep this from side to cut the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. Needless to say, although some patients were thought of as being successful lobotomies, possibly because if the patient was able to walk away on their own and talk normal, it could be seen as successful. Never mind the fact that the person was now fucked up in numerous other ways, but at least they were docile, right? Yikes. Anyways, sticking a long instrument said to be a steel spike into someone's brain and then scrambling them is probably going to produce unwanted results, like the horror stories that we have all heard of. Fun fact, Rosemary Kennedy, sister to John F. Kennedy, had some mental health issues, and after a botched lobotomy, which would leave her unable to care for herself and permanently debilitated, she was put in a place for adults with disabilities where she was left for the rest of her life, and many sources say her mother didn't visit her there for 20 years and that her father, sadly, never did before she died, which is horrific. Okay, so after Milton had the lobotomy done, it left him less than capable, sadly. When Milton's decomposing body was eventually found behind the shed, it was seen that Milton, too, had been violently beaten and then strangled. One source would say that it was an old toilet that Gary had used to beat Milton with. The tank and lid were both broken, and on Milton's body, the authorities would find cuts. They would also find dirt and leaves had been shoved into the mouth of poor Milton. Danny, the witness at the bar the night before, said that he thought Milton may have gotten into Gary's car thinking that it was a taxi for all he knew. He didn't seem to believe that Milton quite knew what was happening in that moment. On an interview with Gary, when he was asked the question of why did he kill Milton, I can't even explain his facial expressions, but basically, he said it was because he claimed that Milton started acting creepy or weird, whatever that means. And then he said he was feeling relief for doing it. Gross. At the scene, there was known to have been a palm print that would later be matched to Gary. So, here's where I'm confused. Gary seemed to identify as straight, yet he's out at these gay bars, playing pool, having drinks. So, was he looking for someone to pay him for his services, or do we think that maybe Gary was gay but couldn't handle it, or felt some type of way, and maybe that's why he went after and killed gay men? Thoughts, anyone? Let me know. After the murder of Milton, sources say that on an episode of America's Most Wanted, that the killings believed to be committed by Gary were shown, and because of this, tips would flood in about where people thought him to be. Around the same time as that episode, Gary's next victim would be found. On May 19, 1994, there would be found the body of Albert Morris, who was said to be 37 years old. Albert was found deceased in the trailer home in Nassau County, Florida, but this crime was a little different. Albert had been shot in the chest, strangled, and beaten in his head with some sort of object, which is just such overkill, and it screams anger to me. But why? This poor man. Albert was also found with what was said to be a towel shoved into his mouth, and it was also said to have been tied up around his head. Gary again took Albert's wallet, credit cards, and stole his car. Gary was said by sources to have met Albert in a gay bar that was in Jacksonville. Not long after the two met, Albert offered Gary a place to stay in Albert's trailer with him. One source would say that Gary had been staying with Albert for around 2 weeks before Albert's murder. On the evening before Albert would be discovered, the two men were spotted in a bar together, and they had apparently been arguing, and it was actually enough to get the men thrown out of the bar. Gary was, again, the main suspect in the murder, but his whereabouts remained a mystery, as he was always on the move. The next victim came from the suspicion of the FBI, who was already tracking the case. They believed that Gary was responsible for a murder that had happened in Atlanta, Georgia, in May of the same year. A 47-year-old man named Alverson Carter Jr. was found dead in his home. The crime scene was similar to the other people that Gary had savagely killed. According to the Southern Voice newspaper, Alverson was found stabbed to death. There would be evidence found near the crime scene that would link Gary later on to the crime, and of course he would eventually confess to all 6 murders. I tried to find out more information about this victim, but I couldn't. This was all that I could find. On November 18, 1994, on a Friday night, a man was supposed to show up to his sister Belinda's birthday celebration, but sadly, the man, Walter Jamil Hinton, also known as Jay, would not make it that night. When Belinda didn't see her brother that evening at Outback, the restaurant that they were all supposed to meet at, she and her husband would go over to Jay's house to see what was going on. Belinda would mention that when they got there, the lights were on in the house, but there was no sign of Walter, and there would be no sign of him over the next 2 days at work either. This is when Belinda and her husband decided to break into her brother's home to see what they could find that might point them to the direction of where Walter was. Belinda said her husband would go through a window on the back side of the house, while she continued to pound on the front door. When Belinda's husband would be the one that opened the door, he immediately tried to push her back and keep her from coming in and seeing what no sister should see: her brother, dead on the floor. Jay was a 42-year-old floral designer who was said to have lived alone. When the authorities would show up at Jay's home, Officer Collins would find Jay dead, and inside of his mouth was stuffed a red rag. At the crime scene, authorities would find Jay's wallet and some papers all laying on the bed. The authorities would take forensic evidence from the bedroom, as laying next to the bed was a big pile of sheets and a 40-pound stepping stone from the front of the house that had blood all over it. They would also find a ton of blood on the bathroom floor where Jay had been found. The thing that would lead the police to Gary finally was in this house. A receipt would be found with the name Timothy Whitfield on it. The ME would figure out in this case that Jay had been killed by strangulation and had been beaten with a stone from the front yard. He had 5 broken ribs and abrasions on one arm and leg, and was found to have been dead for more than 3 days when he was finally discovered. Besides the red rag lodged into his throat was also toilet paper. After the investigation into the murder of Jay had started, neighbors, friends, and witnesses all stated that Jay had someone staying with him at the time, and he was the leading suspect in the murder. The composite sketch of this Timothy Whitfield was then made, and it didn't take long for the authorities to find the suspect. Timothy Whitfield, aka Gary Bowles, was found and arrested at the labor pool at Jacksonville Beach. They would learn the 32-year-old man that they were dealing with was indeed Gary Bowles. After the murder of Milton in Savannah, Georgia, Captain John Best of the Savannah-Chatham Metro PD says that while he was on the case as a rookie, he had a hard time getting people to believe his theory that whoever had murdered Milton used things to stuff in their victims' mouths as like his signature. He would also say on an interview with AETV that his gut was telling him that the fact that this victim was killed so close to Interstate I-95 that maybe it was a factor in the case, and he would turn out to be right. His thought was that the killer could be a serial offender and that this was not the only murder, so he would send out a message to other local departments in the Southeast region to let them know that if they had other similar cases, seemingly maybe vulnerable or gay men as victims, to let him know. This is when Major Tom Reeves with the Nassau County, Florida Sheriff's Department had gotten a hold of then Detective Best and talked to him about the murder of Albert, left in his trailer home with items stuffed in his mouth. Together, the two departments brought the case to the FBI, and this was back in May of 1994. The pieces were all starting to fit together to name Gary Ray Bowles as the suspect in multiple murders along I-95. After Gary was found in Jacksonville Beach, the authorities would learn how he got the name Timothy Whitfield. Apparently, after Gary had killed his last victim, Jay, he was rummaging through his home and in his closet, for whatever reason, found a man named Timothy Whitfield's driver's license and birth certificate. Gary said he took them from the house, went down to the DMV, claiming that he lost his license, and then he would become Timothy Ronald Whitfield. After Gary was arrested, he was being questioned and started giving details to the police, but they weren't right. So Officer Collins, who had been questioning him, called him out on this, and he told him to stop lying. This is when Gary would get super pissed, and he gets in Officer Collins' face, and he was like, if you want the truth, then fine. He's going to give it to him. He yelled at the officer's face that he was actually Gary Ray Bowles, like it was some sort of victory for him to be himself. Dumbass. I guess after this, he kind of was glad that it was over and then confessed to everything. He was only charged with one murder, though, which I thought was odd. Like, shouldn't the families of the other people killed get their day in court? When confronted with the thought of being a gay man in an interview with one of the investigators on the case, a man named Youngman, Gary would tell him that he would allow the men to perform acts on himself, but he never did anything to the men. When Youngman told Gary that those were acts of homosexuality, Gary replied with no. So when Youngman asked Gary if he wasn't gay, then what was he? Gary replied, quote, I'm a hustler. This, according to the Gainesville Sun. The interview that I watched from the AETV coverage of Gary was so freaky to me because he just sat there. This stone-cold killer who clearly could use someone and then kill them for their money and car and just take off like it was nothing, just talked about murder and these men like it was no big deal. Almost like he maybe didn't understand the big fuss that everyone was making. It was something else. I will have the link in the show notes. On December 8th, 1994, Gary Ray Bowles would be charged with first-degree murder of Jay Hinton and for the robbery. The prosecution in the case would argue that Gary was motivated by money and his hatred of gay people. What a loser. The defense would argue that Gary was mentally impaired from all of the abuse that he had suffered as a kid, and that the night of the murder, this was all made worse because he was drinking and smoking weed. Then they argued the murderer didn't have a motive of hatred or money. The jury would, of course, find Gary guilty of first-degree murder and for the robbery, and then he was sentenced to death. The suggestion was death by electric chair. After the Supreme Court of Florida would review the case against Gary, they would actually overturn the death sentence and order a new sentencing trial over not being able to connect Jay's murder with the hate of gay men. So they had to re-argue in front of a jury about the sentence. And again, the jury would come back after just 1 hour. They came back with the death sentence. Again. Gary Ray Bowles was set to be executed on August 22nd in 2019, so not that long ago, in Florida State Prison in Rayford. He had spent 15 years on death row. On the day of his execution, Gary's last meal was said to be 3 cheeseburgers with French fries and bacon. There were said to be a whopping 29 people at his execution to watch him die. Gary was said to have not had a last statement before his execution, but he had written a 2-page note that was later released to the media and basically said he was sorry for all of the pain and suffering that he caused to Jay's family and friends, and that he never wanted to kill him. He then said he hoped his death would ease the pain for them. Whatever, you fucker, you did what you did and you did it on purpose. Don't act like you care now. Gary would be executed by lethal injection, and it was said that as the first one went in, he was murmuring things that were incoherent, and then he passed out. According to the Florida Times-Union, Gary Bowles was the 99th person to be executed in Florida since the Supreme Court restored the death penalty in 1976. Investigators in the case believe that if Gary had not been caught, he would have continued to keep killing. And that, my friends, is the story of the I-95 killer, Gary Ray Bowles. Homophobe? Maybe. Gay man? Maybe. Shitbag? Definitely. So this story caught my attention because of the manner of how the victims were found with something stuffed inside of their mouths. I'm sorry if this is morbid. It was just interesting. I think that we have seen other victims killed in similar fashions, and it had come down to a sadistic way of maybe like humiliating the victim, if I remember correctly. I really want to know what that is about. Like, I'm not here to kink shame people who like to inflict pain to get their jollies. If you have a consenting partner who maybe likes the pain, then by all means, go nuts, right? But it really intrigues me, this whole part about the humiliation. What is that? Does anyone know where that comes from? Why that might be in someone's psyche as a part of their kink or the thing that gets them off? I find myself wondering in these cases if they themselves, while they were possibly abused as children, did they feel some sort of humiliation in that abuse? And now, when they are able to be the ones who inflict the humiliation or embarrassment on someone else, it could maybe let them feel powerful or gives them somewhere to place all of that anger and rage. That's the thing that turns them on, maybe? The power? Who the fuck knows? But there's gotta be a reason for that to be a part of it. And also, why is stuffing things into people's mouths a part of humiliation? I have so many questions. Is it stuffed into their mouths before they're killed because the murderer thinks that it's going to embarrass or humiliate them? Is it shoved in there after for the body to be found in a humiliating way? How does someone decide what they're going to use to lodge it down someone's throat? And why that item? These are things that I think about in different cases. The why of it all is the most interesting part of true crime to me. I want to know why. If you know why, anything, I hope that you will share with us over on the TheKillFile's social medias. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this case as much as I did, and I hope that none of us will let someone who we meet at a bar be our house guest because they could just be a serial killer on the loose. Come back next Monday where we will cover another case here on the TheKillFile where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, thekillfile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow the TheKillFile on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on the TheKillFile where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.